Hello, I'm Avi Lewis. Welcome to a special edition of CounterSpin in Quebec City. Like most of the people in this room, I learned most about one subject this weekend. That subject is tear gas. Although it's supposed to subdue people, its actual effect is the exact opposite. Being gassed makes you enraged. Tear gas doesn't discriminate. It pays no attention to perimeters, to protest tactics, or to politics. It's like a weather system, a sphere of influence. It's even a bit like the one-size-fits-all economic model which was on trial here in Quebec. At its source, it's theatrical, a grand spectacle of smoke. As it drifts out from the center, it becomes silent and invisible, but it catches in the throat all the same, and its effects are everywhere you look. The closest I got to the fence this weekend was 4 blocks away, but for most of the last 3 days, I've been burning and choking and fighting a powerless rage at the blanket effect of this toxic substance. And I've had it good. On Friday night, a group of 1,000 young people who were dancing under a bridge, far from the fence, were gassed without provocation, with a helicopter hovering overhead to keep the chemicals on the ground. Last night, a first aid center to help people who had been gassed was gassed. So keep this in mind when you watch the images of this weekend's confrontations. I didn't come here wanting to talk about violence. Like thousands of other people, I came here this weekend to talk about trade and democracy and human rights and social justice. But it's hard to talk, let alone protest, when you're choking. Maybe that's the point. From Friday afternoon on, all anyone in this town was talking about, the protesters, the residents, the journalists, and many of the delegates, was the gas. So we're going to try to stick with the substance of trade deals and democracy clauses tonight. But you may find that the conversation keeps drifting back to clouds and canisters. It's something in the air. Our goal tonight is to take down the barrier between summit boosters and their critics and debate whether or not free trade increases freedom. So at the front of the room, we've got a panel of people who were inside, and in the audience, people who were in the streets. In between them, nothing but my microphone. Joining us tonight, Lionel Hurst, Ambassador to the Organization of American States from Antigua and Barbuda. Welcome, Lionel.
Delighted to be here.
Beside him, all right, hold your applause until the end or something, okay? Beside him is Osvaldo Rosales, the Director General for International Trade for Chile. Welcome, Osvaldo. Liberal, they don't listen to me. The audience doesn't listen. That's okay. I'm used to it. Liberal MP Bill Graham is the chair of the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee. Now you're going to have to clap for Bill. Welcome, Bill. Thank you. And Aaron Lucas is with the Cato Institute in Washington. Welcome, Aaron. Thank you. All right, Lionel, the big achievement at the end of the summit, the part that our government certainly is the most eager to talk about, is the democracy clause. You were involved in negotiating it. What do you think it will achieve? What's its purpose?
It is really intended to deter militaries from illegally seizing power in the countries of Latin America. But I must tell you that when the discussion on the democracy clause came to the fore last Sunday afternoon when we were negotiating, it was my colleague from Jamaica who raised some questions about it and even said he had instructions to stand alone. The democracy clause says if you interrupt the normal process of democracy, then you are not permitted to participate in the Summit of the Americas process. The question is, what does that mean for contracts? Does it mean that the head of state only will not be allowed to participate? Does it mean that the government will not be allowed to participate? Does it mean that private contracts that have been negotiated between firms will now have to come to an end?
Let's start. Folks, when you speak from the floor, introduce yourself the first time you talk. What do you think the democracy clause will achieve? I got the mic.
Okay. My name's Gerard Greenfield. Well, in principle, I support the democracy clause, but, you know, we have to keep in mind that if it worked, there wouldn't be anyone left in the OAS. And it would be a question...
All right, folks, let's agree that it may be a long night if we clap after every point we agree with, so can we do that? Let's do it at the end of the show. Finish your point.
So the point is that, for example, if you had the democracy clause and it was functioning, would that mean that the illegal seizure of power in the streets by the police in Quebec City would qualify for Canada's expulsion from the Summit of the Americas, from the OAS? I mean, this is what it's about.
Bill, what's your take on the amount of democracy we had in Quebec City this weekend?
Well, I think there's two aspects to democracy. One of them is the elected representative of the people have a democratic right to meet together and discuss these issues that we're here to discuss, and to try and come to the best resolution we can in the best interest of all the people that they represent. And we have a right to have those meetings, and they shouldn't be interrupted. And it was very unfortunate that a fence had to be constructed. It was unfortunate that steps had to be taken You mentioned about the tear gas. I too got tear gas. We all did when we were walking around the city. It's
Did
very
you
unfortunate,
find it a politicizing and radicalizing experience?
No, I didn't, Abby. But I also watched the television last night and saw scenes of indescribable destruction of people that I don't think is proper in our country. But I don't accept that we have become an undemocratic country because of it. We still have a democratic institutions here. We're still working as hard as we can to make those democratic institutions work, and that's the purpose of the summit, is to try and make that work throughout the Americas. So why don't we work together on it rather than trying to shut down the process?
I agree that, you know, the rioting and destruction that the police were involved in this whole past couple of days, I think it was a real problem. And when the police are rioting, fortunately, we had a lot of activists in the street trying to get them under control. I agree with you. But the point is that what you have to deal with here is that people are very aware of the threat to their livelihood and well-being of the kinds of deals that you're talking about. You talk about elected representatives with their democratic rights. What about the mass of working people who don't have any right to know what you're talking about and what the consequences are of your discussions?
Well, I don't accept that. I mean, I don't accept that there's no right to discuss.
That's why you built the fence.
No.
But in any negotiation, I believe that if you have a public forum and you're attempting to negotiate anything seriously in a public forum, that you are likely to encounter grave difficulties. There must be a cadre of people assigned the task of negotiating, and you must, the people, that is, must give them the authority to decide on their behalf, or else you're going to have 500 million people trying to negotiate among themselves.
that might look like fun. We have José Bové here, who is a farmer from France, who is handing out free Roquefort cheese in Seattle as a trade protest, who also strategically dismantled a McDonald's in protest of the import of hormone-treated beef in France. What kind of democracy have you seen in Quebec City?
Well, for me, what's happening here is not democracy. When so many people couldn't come inside Canada, were blocked in all the borders, that's not democracy. I couldn't come inside Canada. They told me I was not allowed to come here. It's only because there was a lot of protest. I had a visa to come inside, and I have to go back because I'm sure I'm not going to be able to come back one more time to Canada. So that's not democracy. And there's a big wall all over Quebec. It's not democracy at all. It's like in Berlin. It's the same thing we saw here. So democracy, it's everything, but not that.
Oswaldo, I want to bring you in this conversation. To what extent do you think that this summit process and the free trade that is at its heart will bring democracy, given the atmosphere in which it's negotiated?
Well, if you think about Latin America, democracy in our region has been very difficult to fight it, and with protectionist strategies. Then there is no automatic link between free trade and democracy. It's important to build this link, but I think it's very important to show us our experience, Chilean experience, in democracy. During the last 10 years, we have had an impressive growth of 6 or 7% a year, with good results in social and economic issues. For example, the increase of our wage has been 4% a year, the highest in the region. And the increase of
Hang on to your mic there, Bill.
minimum wage.
He's going to throw his microphone at me.
Yes.
Vandals. I'm sorry, go ahead.
The increase in minimum wage has been higher than the middle. And the most important, we have reduced the poverty from 40% of our population to 20%. And this has been possible thanks to our export growth model. Then, for us, it's very important to have open markets to enhance democracy and all the freedom of the people.
Does someone want to address the notion of export models of, in terms of how they increase democracy and freedom in Latin America? Are you ready to take that on?
What I just wanted to say is that what does this do to your culture if 50% of your culture is imported, is American culture? Your culture becomes prepackaged, becomes mediocrity, and becomes American culture, how do you protect your own culture?
How do you protect your culture?
Well, I don't know about him, but tourism is what we do for a living. We welcome more than 100 times our population size into Antigua every year. We have a small population of about 100,000. More than 10 million people will pass through Antigua. They'll come on cruise ships, and many will come to our hotels. That's how we make a living. What we have found as a result of having tourism as a means of making a living is that we have to preserve our culture so that when you come to visit us, you see something that is interesting, new, different, just as Quebec does. I've been down here to the Museum of Civilization and around the old city. What magnificent buildings you have here in Quebec City, and that's what we try to do in Antigua. Our culture is thereby preserved by the mere fact that we are selling it to others.
There you go. Culture is preserved by selling it to others.
May I add something about
Yeah, let me let Maud respond, and then...
I want to talk about this democracy issue, though. This notion that there's going to be a democracy clause, as I understand it, any country that is not considered democratic won't be allowed into the FTAA. I can't think of a better reason for a coup d'etat myself, but that being said, I want to talk about the process...
The Council of Canadians become more radical recently.
I just want to talk about the process this week and this democracy clause, because I think this democracy clause is a poor excuse or an impoverished excuse to cover what has happened this week. And it's, you know, many people are very concerned about what happened. And many of us feel that, first of all, we don't trust trade agreements to look after democracy. You're already dictating our environment policy. Trade agreements are already dictating our social policy, our health and food policy, and we don't trust it to dictate our democracy policies. But most importantly, what I want to say here is that if you really cared about democracy, we would have had that text months ago. We would have had a real dialogue. We would never have had the wall. Corporations could not have bought their way in while the rest of us had to stay out. And you would be giving us a full referendum on this hemisphere to see if we want what you've been negotiating in behind those closed doors.
Right.
Aaron,
go ahead.
I would also like to raise a critical voice in regards to the democracy clause, but from the other side, from the question that we just heard. My worry is that what we're essentially saying to countries is when your citizens are deprived of their political freedoms, well, then we will automatically deprive them of their economic freedoms as well. In fact, this is the strategy that has been applied towards Cuba by the United States for the past 4 decades. Well, you're not a democracy, therefore we won't allow our businesses and our individuals to trade with you or to travel with you. And I don't think trade sanctions ultimately are a very good way of promoting democracy. So I worry that despite the very good intentions surrounding the democracy clause, we could actually end up retarding the development of freer economies and ultimately democracy.
That will answer the question of apartheid in South Africa, because one of the ways we ended apartheid in South Africa was by imposing the same kinds of sanctions that we have in mind in the democracy clause. The way we brought down the military plotters in Haiti was by doing exactly the same thing. And here in our hemisphere, we know, those of us from very small countries know, that unless we are swimming in a sea of successful states, our country is likely to be unsuccessful. And therefore, we want to see all the countries in this hemisphere as success. And there's only one way to do it, to have them sell goods to markets, and as a result, increase their wealth.
This is what we have to debate, whether there's only one way to do it. Hold on. On the point of democracy, unfortunately, television is not a democracy, which is why I have to call for a commercial. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. We're back on a special edition of CounterSpin in Quebec City. We've been talking about democracy and trade, and I want to shift just slightly in the rhetoric department to talk a little bit about freedom, because President George W. Bush framed our whole conversation nicely the other day when he said, quote, "Trade not only helps spread prosperity, trade helps spread freedom." So I want to put that thesis to the CounterSpin crew and have a little debate about that. Go ahead.
What I want to talk about is exactly that, because the democracy clause may say we don't yes or in the hemispheric summit, but what it doesn't say is that the trade deals create governments that have less and less power and corporations that have more and more. So we have what? The freedom to choose between McDonald's and Harvey's. We have a democracy that says we can pass laws, but if a transnational sues us, we're going to dump them. That's what's wrong with these agreements, is that they create a veneer of democracy, but a reality of corporate control.
Well,
You're Elizabeth May, right?
Oh, I forgot to introduce
That's
myself.
okay.
Elizabeth May, Sierra Club of Canada.
Elizabeth, I think you'll agree with me that we are becoming more and more integrated throughout the hemisphere and throughout the world anyway. And I suggest to you that if we don't have agreements and if we don't have rules to regulate one another's conduct, in fact, it's going to be worse. The major corporations and the big powers are going to run everything, and we'll have nothing to stand between us. And that's why you come to the committee, and that's why we try and negotiate rules. So I don't think you should be fighting the free trade of the Americas. That's what I think is great about this summit. For the first time, we're really talking about all those other dimensions that we should be bringing into our lives.
I'm in favor of an international program of rules and regulations under the United Nations that mandate minimum standards for environment, health and safety, child labor, and human rights that all transnationals must abide by, or we execute them. I want transnational corporations to face capital punishment if they will not protect the environment and human rights.
Hold on.
We pulled their corporate costs.
How do you execute a corporation?
It's
Wow,
easy. It's
I
easy.
thought we were against capital punishment in this country.
Against real live breathing
It's sort of
human
selective. Who gets executed? It's
Monsanto.
not the bad
Let me
guys
explain why. These companies exist by a societal consensus that allowed originally, Christopher Columbus to sail across the ocean with a charter that said we're going to protect you from certain risks. It's a societally endowed privilege to operate as a unnatural person, a corporate fiction. And we have created these entities, and we act as if they have real lives and real rights. They don't. We do. And that corporate behavior is killing the planet. And I want to ask Ambassador Hearst what's going to happen to Antigua and Barbuda if we don't do something about climate change. The same people who are sitting up on the hill right now having lunch are plotting the demise of the planet by continuing to pump fossil fuels into the United States and send them up to destroy the atmosphere. We need to talk about real issues.
Go ahead.
Well, there is a serious problem with climate change, there's no doubt. But climate change is the result of our energy consumption habits. It's also the result of the way we produce the energy. If you're relying upon petroleum and coal to produce the majority of the electricity which you need, the stuff which powers our cars, then you are inevitably going to use the sky as a dumping ground. The question is, do you want to continue to do that? And the answer to that is no. Very small states like mine are very interested in having large states like the United States and Canada switch to more renewable energy sources so that our environment is saved for future generations.
Okay, this is a very important point. When we're talking about freedom and we're talking about sovereignty of states, is there anything in these agreements and in this process that genuinely protects smaller countries, which is everybody in the hemisphere except the United States, from bigger countries, which is the United States, the GDP of which is larger than all of the other countries combined? We've seen no reduction in U.S. unilateralism since George Bush came to power. Certainly, he's ditched Kyoto. We're having all kinds of problems on softwood lumber. And the subsidies to agriculture and other things have not come down in the United States, despite many years of the free trade regime already. So what is the evidence that smaller countries are actually going to be protected from larger countries in this sea that you were talking about?
Well,
it's sharks and sardines.
We have succeeded in quite a bit in using the dispute resolution mechanisms and NAFTA to protect ourselves from U.S. unilateralism. It's not been perfect, but it's been better than I'd suggest to you that if we hadn't had it. And that's a very, very important thing. You always, is the glass half empty or half full? I mean, that's the way we're always looking at these things. But Abby, you know as well as I do, you talk about softwood lumber. We've won 3 softwood lumber cases. I mean, you can't help the fact that American politics works the way it does. And they do act unilaterally, but that's why we need the rules. That's why we need something. We need our fence to protect us against them. And that fence is juridical rules that enable us to do it. And you know that as well as I do.
We're talking about freedom and the right to protect, Judy Darcy, Canadian Union of Public Employees, talking about freedom and the right to protect the environment. A small town in Mexico a few years ago stood up and said, we don't want a toxic waste site in our community. Their city council listened to them as they should have, and that company in the end, Metalclad, sued under Chapter 11 of NAFTA, and now Mexico is being forced to pay $20 million in damages. Why? Because a community stood up and said, we don't want more miscarriages, we don't want more birth defects, we have the right to protect the lives and health of our children. And those same clauses are in all the trade agreements we're talking about. We're talking about overriding the democratic rights of governments and people to protect their health care, their education, their environment, and their public services.
If you're going to cite the Metalclad case, I think you have to be fair about it. The reason why Mexico is paying damages, and that is because the Mexican federal government invited that company there and gave it assurances it could do what it was doing. That's why it is being done. I don't disagree with you, and Maud and I, we've had these discussions discussions about Chapter 11. Everybody's agreeing we've got to relook at Chapter 11. Right. That's a problem, but I don't think you throw the baby out with the bathwater. You don't destroy everything
We just got a hold of the leaked text, because we couldn't get it from you, that shows us that you are keeping Chapter 11. The FTA is going with a full Chapter 11 investment clause.
Okay, so this is, just to be clear, this is the clause that allows corporations to sue governments for regulations that impinge on their ability
and more importantly, it's foreign corporations. It's not your own domestic
all that shows, that's the whole problem with this text business. All that shows is that somebody has proposed that. There's 34 people out there in the United States may be proposing it. But you know very well that until this thing is signed 6 or 7 years or 10 years from now, because it's going to be that long, and maybe never if the Brazilians get their way, you know, this won't happen. So I don't think you should raise that as a scare tactic.
I think you mischaracterized a bit what Chapter 11 and similar regulations actually do. It doesn't prevent in any way, shape, or form any country from passing any type of law it wants to protect its own health, welfare, and environment. What it does do is say you can't pass those type of regulations in a way that is protectionist. You can't say discriminatory, yes.
See, Aaron, the reason that that's a hard sell in this room is because United Parcel Service is suing Canada Post for having the audacity to deliver packages. So, hey, no applauding from me. That's strictly forbidden. So that's why you're hearing the skepticism.
They haven't won.
But why should they even have the right to do that? It's a fundamental public service.
In this country,
see, what people object to is that it shows who's writing the rules.
Well, all it does is allow foreign companies, American companies, Mexican companies, to take advantage of the same due process of law that's available to a Canadian company.
No, precisely, and I'll tell you something else.
CounterSpin is suing the United States government for making cars.
Go for it.
Go ahead, Matthew. Matthew Kuhncamp.
I am the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, and you talk about protection of smaller states. I want to talk about people. I want to talk about indigenous peoples. We number 40 million in the Western Hemisphere. We are the most marginalized, dispossessed. Any development that happens when you extract natural resources, whether it be oil, gas, or energy, affects our livelihood, affects our economies, and yet we are being excluded. That to me is totally unacceptable. And yet when we participate in a civil society, we are not a component of a civil society. As indigenous peoples, we are governments, we are nations, and we are peoples. And we are very concerned about economic issues, social issues, protection of our culture and in our societies, to be able to avoid any imposition of alien forms of governance when we have our own forms of government. And here you're talking about democracy. Democracy should respect that we, as indigenous peoples, have the right to self-determination, meaning that we have the right to be able to establish our own political societies, to be able to establish and have a share in the wealth of the country, because we are the poorest of the poor, and yet we are being excluded. There should be a right to be included in any process where we can participate, because development will affect us.
Bill.
Well, we have, if you forgive me,
Lionel, go ahead.
Although there are no indigenous people any longer on Antigua and Barbuda, I can tell the leader of the First Nations that at the Organization of American States, Antigua and Barbuda, in my person, has allowed the leader of the indigenous peoples from Latin America to sit in our seat and to make statements from our chair when there was an attempt to exclude indigenous peoples from participation in the OAS meetings. And Antigua and Barbuda and other countries in the Caribbean will continue to show great support for indigenous peoples throughout the entire hemisphere, knowing fully well what your history has been and what the history of other peoples in this hemisphere has been since 1492.
I wonder if the Prime Minister of this country would allow me to take his seat.
Well, but you know what, actually, Bill, can you get the PM on the cell phone? We've got to take another break. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. I want an answer on that. Can you get JC? Come on. You got the phone. Come on.
He doesn't answer my phone.
He's got a big chair.
He's probably answering yours faster than mine.
All right, give me your phone. I'll call him myself. We've been having a little spontaneous and thoroughly peaceful musical interlude. Go ahead, you've been waiting patiently. I noticed you weren't chanting there in the break.
My name is Kendra Okonski. I actually came up here to observe the protest and to kind of get an understanding from a different point of view. I actually support free trade. I think that free trade agreements actually don't go far enough in supporting free trade. And I actually, when I was talking to people over these past couple days, I found them a bit disingenuine. In that, I mean that these are people who have had a chance to benefit from wealth from Canada's and the United States openness to trade with other countries. A lot of the protesters were carrying very expensive video cameras. I don't own that sort of thing, but I still support free trade. I think that trade is giving people choices that they won't.
Issue of protectionism from the North.
Organizations had come together here to protest together, and I don't think that's odd at all. I think it's wonderful. And I think that the reason why we all came was because we agreed with differing groups. And I would just like to know how many more people we need here than 20 to 70,000 to have our leaders listen to the people and quit calling us hooligans.
Bill?
Well, I totally agree with the right of people to protest. I think it's wonderful that people have come and showed their will to try and make changes. But I think we have to have the discussion about it. I go back to the lady who talked about the environment, and Elizabeth May comes before our committee. We're struck in this problem. Talk about air quality, but Canada's going to regulate our air quality by ourselves when we've got neighbors with winds blowing across us that bring pollution and everything. We have to do this in an international environment. We have to have rules. We have to work for that. And I think the people here, by demonstrating, are forcing everybody in the political system to recognize we have to change those rules and work for them. All I'm saying is give us a chance to work with them and try and change them, but we can't do it if we're demonstrating all the time and not actually working with these representatives from other countries. I mean, it's a part of the process. You have to have both.
Go ahead.
Okay, we're talking about setting rules. I think we've got to go right back to the fundamentals. The basis of all these rules is that everything's a commodity. We're talking about protecting the environment, but we're talking about it in terms of natural resources. We're talking about people's rights, but we're talking about them in terms of human capital, who gets to have what jobs and where the wage costs are lowest. If we're going to have, you know, the kind of wonderful hemisphere that you're talking about, we've got to start thinking of people and the environment as something that has natural beauty in and of itself. And we've got to address the whole fundamental question of what this whole trade agreement, which is all about, which is money before everything else, profit before everything else. The whole system, the whole basis, the entire game has got to be changed. It's not a matter of tinkering with the rules.
This reminds me of what Lionel was saying, and that the way to protect the environment of a country with a lot of tourism is to market it, is to commodify it.
But let me point out, though, that we quite disagree with the United States President to scrap the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and its Kyoto Protocol.
So do we.
Clearly, the United States, and indeed we stand with Canada, clearly the United States has made an incorrect decision. And it's a foolhardy decision, because there is no way in the world that the United States can reverse global warming once its intensity has begun to pick up. And for those of us living on very small, vulnerable islands, we know exactly what that means. We've seen the erosion of our beaches, we've seen the destruction of our reefs, we've seen the die-off of many species. And we know that, and not to mention the hurricanes, they come in every summer in increasing frequency.
Well, what was the first thing that George W. Bush talked about when he actually got sitting down with our Prime Minister? According to published reports, it was a continental energy policy to facilitate more energy to the United States from more places in the hemisphere. All of these deals are locking in the economic primacy of the United States. Well, surely that's what's driving it.
Well, but I think that one of the things about this summit that's very interesting, Avi, is that precisely we're finally getting a dialogue with other states around other issues than just what the United States wants for its energy policy and what the United States wants unilaterally. We're finally bringing in Brazil, which is a big power, and Chile, which is now our partner, to say, look, we've got other objectives. And this summit, for the first time, it's not just the democracy clause. We're talking about funding for education, funding for health. At the meeting that Matthew came to with me yesterday, we had PAHO there, the health organization, we had the funding institutions there. There is a real will to try and make the changes that people in this room want to see made. But we have to let them do it in the summit. And a man like the ambassador here comes and participates in it because he recognizes his island has a lifeline, that this is a part of the process, and we have to make it work.
Bill Blakey, go ahead. You're going to get a chance to respond.
Well, you
to this
talked about things being locked in, I mean, I think this is the subtext of the argument about democracy and free trade. Sure, a lot of people that didn't used to care much about whether there was democracy in South America and Central America, now they feel democracy is a great thing. Why? Because you can only have certain kinds of democracies. Democracy can only operate within a certain ideological paradigm. They operate under the commodification of everything. They operate according to free markets, and if they operate differently than that, they run up against the free trade agreements. So these free trade agreements are designed to make the world safe from democracy, not safe for democracy. No. And so, to me, it's a bit of a fraud to have this democracy clause, because they're basically saying, yeah, you can have democracy, but it can only operate within these certain parameters. And if you step outside those parameters, we have these free trade agreements to make sure that you behave in a certain way. And that, to me, is the fraud behind the democracy clause.
Osvaldo, I have to operate within the parameters of television. I'm just going to take one more commercial, and you're going to get the first shot when we come back. We'll be back.
Frankly speaking, I'm not comfortable on this session. I think it's an unfair meeting. All these issues are very difficult issues. It's not, in my opinion, the best way to try to deal with this with simplicity, with easy sentences. The majority of the official government, of Chilean government, fight against Pinochet. I may share good number of your issues, but I don't understand the easy link, the round link between free trade and all your issues. I have all your warning about environment, about labor, about human rights. And my question to you is, please, we need to think with a more serious way, because the world is changing. Globalization is going away. If you like or you don't like, the task is more important.
This is a
excuse me.
I don't have a lot of time, so I want someone to respond
final
to
sentence.
this.
Our main goals are health, education, employment, housing, good employment. And we think really that the last 10 years our outcome, our results have been good. But my question is, all these goals need results, need growth. The question is, today, in the actual world, is possible to have important growth to reduce poverty and to increase the opportunity without export, without free trade? Please think about it.
Can you answer this question?
If you want to talk about the fundamentals, one of the fundamentals is whether you sat down and talked about third world debt and the immediate and complete cancellation of third world debt and reparations. Reparations for colonialism, reparations for US military aggression in the region. Because when you talk about poverty, you make it sound as if you're just coming out of, that poverty came from nowhere. This poverty was created. And the kind of growth you're talking about. Yes, the kind of growth.
What is the best way to reduce poverty?
Well, the best
growth.
way is, well, it's not through export-oriented growth that destroys diversity, that denies people's rights, and allows a handful of transnational corporations to accumulate wealth at the expense of people's lives. That what we're talking about here is that you cannot have a level playing field. You talk about the United States and he's the bad kid on the block for this week. Fine. But if you talk about cancelling third world debt, you talk about reparations, and you talk about not an export-driven model which protects the rights of transnational corporations, you talk about a different kind of development and alternatives.
I don't
and
say
you may not like this kind of meeting, and I know you're...
I don't say that.
But the point about it is that in terms of the diversity of what people are bringing here, it's exactly the diversity that people want to preserve. And the fact that we can work together...
You are making
there was
a
another
bad
slogan.
translation of my
There's
words.
another slogan that you probably don't know, and it's that this is what democracy looks like. And that's what it's about. It's about respecting the diversity of all of the issues that people are bringing here and seeing very seriously that this is a threat to people's livelihood. The kind of growth that you're talking about, the neoliberal model, is not the growth that people want because it's been proven in the last 20 years it will not benefit the majority of the people.
That is not true. That is absolutely
not true.
That is absolutely untrue. And if you look at the United States itself as a free trade area, you will know that historically when states in the United States impose duties and taxes upon goods moving across their borders and into their borders, they had great difficulty in creating trade. Once the Commerce Clause was accepted into the United States Constitution and all those barriers disappeared, trade in the United States took off like an explosion. And this is what we hope we can do throughout the entire hemisphere.
Go ahead.
Reduce the barriers.
You talk about democracy, but what has happened in Chile? I'll tell you what's happened in Chile. The human rights issues have not been resolved in Chile. You talk about resolving human rights issues. Let's talk about Nicaragua. Well, in 1988, the World Court condemned the U.S. for unlawful use of force. The U.S. ignored that judgment. You talk about democracy. Why did the U.S. under corporate sponsorship?
You know, I got to interrupt you just for a moment. I have to say goodnight. We're out of time. Thanks for coming, everybody. I have a feeling that there's a lot of untapped argument in this room. So with your permission, can we stay here for a little while? We're going to keep talking. We're just going to keep talking. We'll show you the tape of it tomorrow on our News World airing at 8 p.m. Eastern. It's repeated at 11 p.m. Eastern. You know where to find us on CounterSpin. Thanks for coming. Good night. Finish your point. Go ahead. We can hear you. Can I get to this guy? He wanted to talk all night. Hang on. I can't stay. Because I'm chair. You know what? You had your hand up. Hello, I'm Avi Lewis. Welcome to CounterSpin. What you're about to see tonight is the continuation of last night's conversation. We're here in Quebec City. We have a magnificent, passionate, and thoroughly expert audience of rabble. and we have reconstituted our panel. We lost a couple of our guests from last night. Bill Graham had to sign something. And no, he did. He had a meeting of parliamentarians that he had to rush off to. But let me introduce the people that we have on our panel, and we'll get right back into the conversation about the FTAA and the Summit of the Americas. Gerard Greenfield is a labor researcher. Aaron Lucas is from the Cato Institute, bravely standing in for American interests in the absence of the delegation, which has already left. Lionel Hurst is the ambassador to the Organization of American States from Antigua. Thanks for staying. And Judy Darcy has joined us from the Canadian Union of Public Employees. I want to talk a little bit about what this weekend and what this whole week has been about. And I want to start to take the temperature of what's been driving this process. I'll give you a couple of accounts to start with. According to an op-ed published in the weekend papers by John Manley and Pierre Pettigrew, quote, Canada and the inter-American community see democracy as the fundamental issue for this hemisphere and the focal point for the summit. On the same day, a U.S. official was quoted saying, in particular about the democracy clause, which was passed here in Quebec City, the president agreed with it, but he indicated, of course, that free trade for the United States is the priority of the summit. Now, there may be other things that are at the heart of this process. Gerard, what do you think what has this week been about?
Well, I think for a start, I mean, people have made it really clear that they understand that this isn't just about trade. That what's really surfaced in this, and what's really interesting, if you bothered to look at the slogans and the banners and stuff, people were really creative, not just with the kind of diversity of issues, but there was one great one from the US, which was FTAA, 34 members, 33 suckers. You know, which really kind of said, like, who's really going to win out of this agreement, right? But there are a lot of other things about fair trade, but about people before profit and corporate power. And I think what it really boils down to is a real challenge, you know, about corporate power. And I was really pleased to see that walking up and looking at the shops, that one of the bordered shops had the sign taken down and someone graffitied on it, McDonald's. And you could actually see where the McDonald's was taken down. It's an understanding that it's about these corporations like McDonald's and so on that people are kind of responding to in terms of their power and wealth.
Aaron.
Well, you know, I have to respectfully disagree. I think if there are 33 suckers at the FTAA meeting, they certainly weren't inside, because the alternative to the FTAA, we have to understand, if we shut this thing down, is that the United States and Canada will be forming bilateral trade agreements with the Latin American and South American countries. Free trade is not something that is being imposed from North America. It is something that is being actively sought on the part of the whole of the Americas.
But you're
and these countries have much better bargaining power in a forum where they can all come together and hash out disagreements than if they're left alone at the mercy of the United States in a bilateral negotiation.
Well, they're already at the mercy of the United States in terms of U.S. military aggression throughout the region. There's a long history of that. We don't have to get into that. But the point about it is that there are 2,000 bilateral investment and free trade treaties around the world today. Within our region, the United States has already signed 30 bilateral free trade agreements with other countries in the region, and Canada has signed 35. There's this web to back up the very fact that if the FTA doesn't go ahead, they'll fall back on this. And the investment treaty includes the right of foreign investor parties to sue governments. It includes that. So it's bullshit to talk about a review of NAFTA Chapter 11. We're concerned about this. We're going to review it. It's there. It's in place. The Canadian government has negotiated with the other countries in the region. You're building on that into the FTA. It's not as if, you know, this is a more multilateral forum in which to create some sort of space for smaller countries.
If there is a web of treaties and other agreements. It is because we are all trying to create wealth. This is the object. There are lots of poor people in the countries of the Americas. Hundreds of millions of people have never even received a telephone call in this hemisphere. And the object of the leaders sitting at table is to ensure that everyone can become connected to the internet and so forth. This is the object. And there are many ways to achieve that. There are many, many ways to achieve that. And the leaders have to determine which might be the better ways or the best ways. And I think that free trade is one of them. This is not a debate that has begun today. Hundreds of years ago, when the British would destroy ships that were carrying goods of their own colonies to other countries, they did that because they wanted to end free trade. And there was a fight against the British imposition of ships only, trade only on their ships to their destinations and so forth. And that all changed. That is not even a part of the discussion today. So from century to century, the discussion and the focus changes. And it is changing now.
Judy.
But it's a myth that these so-called free trade agreements are just about trade, for starters. We're also talking about public services that are on the table in these free trade negotiations. We have our Canadian government tries to reassure us, oh, don't worry, your health care is secure, your public education is secure, your water and your environment are secure. Not true. They told us that health care would be protected under previous trade agreements and under ones they're negotiating right now. How can the Canadian government expect us to believe that health care, for instance, is protected when health insurance is explicitly on the table in the GATS talks? And how can we expect a government to protect our health care when they won't even enforce their existing laws like the Canada Health Act, when our Alberta government brings in private hospitals, and when there are clear legal opinions that say that under the terms of NAFTA, that opens the door wide to multinational healthcare corporations coming in and setting up shop. So it's about far more than goods, it's about far more than trade, it's about public services, it's about what we've decided democratically as a people that we believe in and that what we want as a country.
I'm going to bring the audience in because people are ready to go.
My question, my name is Peter Jaworski, by the way, has less to do with what you said. I did want to emphasize that I do support free trade, real, honest, genuine, open free trade. Now I brought the complete works of Shakespeare here to demonstrate my point. I'm concerned
Folks, I don't know where this is going, but let's stay together until it gets dull.
Let me begin by saying the complete works of Shakespeare is 1,274 pages. A copy of NAFTA is approximately 1,200 to 1,500 pages. And I'm assuming that the FTAA agreement is going to be perhaps around the same size. My concern is I believe in free trade, and I'd like to see all members of society to be able to take advantage of that free trade. But I'm concerned that other than multinational groups and people who can hire a lawyer or an accountant, small businesses won't be able to read the entire document and take advantage of free trade. So I suppose that question is to the ambassador, because
well, especially this is a question for small countries who don't have the negotiating power, who don't have the infrastructure, who need help at the WTO just to attend the meetings.
Well, we have set up regional negotiating machinery in the Caribbean, and we've pooled our resources, and we have a few experts, and they're the ones that are doing the negotiating on our behalf. But let me just point out to my good friend here that...
And very well-read friend.
Indeed. That if you took all the cases that the United States Supreme Court has decided on matters relating to trade among the states of the United States, they would exceed the complete works of Shakespeare, and they would certainly exceed the FTAA agreement, which is yet to come. My point is that you have to have rules, and those rules are going to be negotiated. They're either negotiated beforehand or after. And in the case in the United States, what they did was they passed the Commerce Clause, and then they negotiated the rules afterwards. What we are attempting to do here is to negotiate first the rules and then put them into effect. I suppose there will be disagreements thereafter, but clearly we are going to exceed the book which you have in hand.
Go ahead.
I think Peter's question, though, is instructive for those who do support free trade, pointing out really a flaw in the strategy of pursuing free trade, which is all coming together in these multilateral institutions. That has been very effective in the past, but it also creates a very big target for people who are opposed to free trade. What we call globalization.
So you'd rather keep it in the back room?
No, I wouldn't like to keep it in the back room, but what I think Canada and the United States in particular should do is unilaterally open their markets to the exports of developing countries. they've in fact been quite shameful in living up to previous
Now, why do you
agreements.
think that is? Why do you think that Canada and the United States, who work so hard to sell the developing countries on how the panacea of free trade, which will mean that textiles and agricultural exports from those developing countries will be freely led, why do you think the barriers are still there?
I think it's the same old question that we confront time and time again of concentrated benefits and diffused interest. There are negotiators in the United States and Canada who have a philosophical commitment to free trade. They have economics they believe to back this up. But then when it actually gets into the sausage factory of domestic politics, you have a lot of interest groups, labor unions and others, that have a very real stake in keeping, that's an old analogy, sausage factory, you don't want to...
Can I
But you have a very real interest in keeping protectionism, and the public at large is much harder to organize.
You're an economist, you can follow this. The point about it is, if you take the United Nations World Development Investment Report of the most recent one, 2000, and if you look at what has happened in the global economy over the last 20 years, and just take the figures, take the statistics, 1982 to 1999, okay? And if you look at the total value, sorry, tear gas.
Sorry. Quick thinking.
If you take the total value of all goods and services across borders, total global exports of the value, and you compare that to the cost, the sales by transnational corporations of their foreign affiliates in a country, and you take those two figures, in 1982, they were both roughly at $2 trillion US, right? 2 trillion for the value of global exports, 2.4 trillion for the value of what TNCs were selling in a country. If you look at 1999, global sales in terms of exports has increased 3 times, right, to just under 7 trillion. But the sales by transnational corporations, it's increased 6 times. And it's double the value of all export of goods and services around the world, $13.5 trillion. So
what does that tell you? What does that tell you?
This is what tells us that this is not about trade. It's about the power and wealth of transnational corporations. It's about their power to enter a domestic market and displace local production, displace local producers. It's not about a diversity and some kind of democratizing. Now, and I can just add, telecommunications, people without telephones, exactly the point. 70% of the world market in telecommunications is dominated by 10 corporations, 6 of them based in the United States. How on earth is a free trade deal that protects the right of those corporations going to give people access to telephones? I just don't see it.
What happens is that these large corporations, they bring their resources, they bring their training to underdeveloped countries, developing countries like my own. Engineers, all kinds of other skills are transferred to us. And little by little, we whittle away some of the monopolies which they may once have had. It is the only way we can do it. There is no other way. There is a very intelligent economist who was awarded the Nobel Prize from the tiny Caribbean island of St. Lucia, a man by the name of Arthur Lewis, who wrote back in 1975 that development has to take place by invitation. And the countries in the Southeast Asian, so-called Southeast Asian tigers developed that model further. And they have benefited tremendously from it. This is how they move their people from misery to poverty and now to development.
Go ahead.
I mean, I think the wonderful thing about this week, and I think we have to go back to what is happening in Quebec City, we've had almost 5 days of discussion among ourselves. Forget what the folks are doing behind the wall. We know what they're doing behind the wall, but we've had the opportunity to talk to ourselves across this country and across this hemisphere in a way we have never talked to ourselves, but what the FTAA project has been about. We've built some wonderful alliances this week, despite the fact we have different diversity of tactics. And more importantly, you keep hearing the argument that somehow free trade will uplift the people of the South, and there's a trade union movement who in the North wants to protect their livelihood. Well, I work in the trade union movement. I travel to the South every day. Well, the trade union movement at the South is saying exactly the same thing. Multinational corporations coming to their country, and of course, the first thing they do is demand the local government somehow get rid of labor laws in those countries. And in the context of that, people keep saying, well, where's those countries defending the rights of workers? It's not that they decide that they don't want to defend. The multinational says they should destroy that. But more importantly, I think this broader misnomer has continued to be perpetuated, that we in the North as trade unionists want to protect our privileged position. Well, Canadian workers in this country and trade unions doesn't have any right to any fixed amount of job in Canada. And in the context of development, in this hemisphere, I believe that the South should share in the jobs. But this is not about that. It wasn't about that with Mexico. Mexico has got NAFTA, and today Mexico is worse off in terms of wages and growth as a country than it ever has been. And they keep saying what we have. the woman who spoke earlier, and I want to get to this point, that somehow we in the North don't have unity. Well, I am going to go to a Congress of 100 million something trade unions, or at Congress going to take place in Washington this week, and we will pass a resolution saying we're firmly against FTAA. But more importantly, countries in the South have already done that. The Argentines have gone through a tremendous upheaval of structural adjustment program. They said, we don't want to follow this model. Brazil have passed a resolution that we don't want to follow this model. And more importantly, rather than listening to the voices of the people and change the direction in the context of an hemispheric integration, they continue to push one model. It's like blindness. There's only one way down the road is to follow this path. There's no other path. And we continue to lock ourselves in. And I think for my friend from the Caribbean, because I was a former Caribbean, I came from the Caribbean. My country suffered from colonialism for quite hundreds of years. It finally gained its freedom, and today is becoming another basket case. It pays more money out of the country than they can keep internally to do what is right for the people. And nobody's talking about that, and they give us this phony discussion about the democracy clause. Well, excuse me, for 30-something years, the United States propped up an undemocratic government to stay in the country, and today they were having a discussion about democracy clause. Democracy is more than the right to go and vote and have your ability to cast your ballot. It is about the rights of citizens to live in a society where they share the wealth. And I think unless we're going to get to that debate, they're not going to succeed. At one point, I want to...
No, that last one was the last one. We got to take a commercial. We'll be back in a second. Do you notice that they twinkle instead of clapping during... This audience has become very well trained for a bunch of anarchist rabble-rousers. Here in Quebec City, this is the second hour of the conversation that we had last night. It's very confusing in television terms, but right now, you want to talk about what's happening in Quebec City.
Oh, okay. Hi, my name is Bree, and I just wanted to kind of bring things down to a simpler level. We're using lots of incredibly complicated economic language. But what I would like to say is one thing that I realized here this weekend is that governments and corporations have kind of joined hands, and they've built a podium, and then they've put themselves up on that podium to try and convince us that they have the answers to regulating the things which are important. But you can't tell in here, but it's raining outside. And the people who are in government and the people who own corporations have no control over that. But they're trying to convince us that they do. Indigenous peoples have lived in this hemisphere for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, and they haven't had trade deals. They haven't had corporations. They haven't had giant institutional governments, and they've managed to breathe beautiful, clean air. They've managed to have enough to eat, to create art, to create culture. I think that governments and corporations have forgotten that the most important things in life are not tiny little pieces of paper, nor are they documents, nor are they silly, abstract words like freedom and democracy that we all throw around, you know, whenever it's convenient for us. As long as we all have food and water and friends, I've made lots of really wonderful friends here this weekend, we have everything we need, and we don't need you to regulate it for us.
I'm going to hug you if you keep going. Go ahead.
I'd like to correct a couple misconceptions. The fact about the whole debate is not per se over trade. The socialist farmers of Saskatchewan have been exporting their wheat for over 100 years, and yet they could still be against free trade agreements that are about limiting democracy in favor of the corporate sector. And in that sense, the so-called democracy clause that's being arrived at this weekend is just as believable as the Santa variety. And I think that the real democracy is happening in this room.
Aaron, you just took a couple of shots at the argument you made. Do you want to respond?
Well, with their specific point again, all this discussion, we talk about freedom and democracy, and I don't think these are just silly abstract terms. In fact, I think they're very important. I think free trade ultimately, and I can agree with you that, that we may indeed come out of trade negotiations with an agreement that is not true free trade, in which case I'll be the first one to stand up in opposition to it. But real free trade is about individual liberty. It's about the freedom of each individual person to transact, to buy something from anyone in the world, regardless of the color of the skin of that person or the language that they speak. And it's the freedom of individuals to do so without interference from everyone else in society.
Judy might actually implode if she doesn't respond to that. Go ahead.
Individual rights or freedom. I mean, in this country, for instance, if you take a poll of people in Canada, 2/3 of them say that If trade deals are in any way going to affect healthcare, education, or the environment, they don't want any part of it. 3/4 of the people in this country say that if water is going to be affected in any way, they don't want any part of it. And yet our governments completely violate public opinion. They have no mandate in any election that they ran in any time to say that they're going to allow us to go down the road of American-style healthcare, for instance, where the quality of healthcare you get depends on the size of your pocketbook, or where we're going to expand what Mike Harris is doing in Ontario with private universities so that young people don't have access to post-secondary education unless they've got a whole lot of money in the bank. And frankly, free trade agreements, so-called free trade agreements, are also about that. So talk about individual rights and freedoms. It's rights for corporations. It's not rights for the majority of the population.
Go ahead. Well, then why not vote out the government in power?
We tried.
I think that needs to be reiterated, that free trade is a total misnomer and that we should not even indulge in that rhetoric. Free trade is not about freedom at all, except freedom for investors. They are investors' rights agreements. And the idea that there is no alternative to these types of agreements that mean doing away with environmental laws and increasing poverty, the idea that there's no alternative to this economic model that has a warped logic, if a logic at all, it's totally unsustainable. That would be naive if it weren't so ridiculous, if it weren't evil. That is the same economic model that right now is leading to species extinction, that is spreading poverty across the planet. And the idea that if we just do more of the same, if we increase free trade, as we've been doing for a long time now, and we've seen the consequences all over the place, the idea that if we do more and we do it everywhere, that it's going to have the exact opposite consequences of what it's had so far is laughable. I mean, get real. Come on.
It's just a bunch of anarchist hooligans. There's no real analysis or alternative.
Sorry, can we just touch on... Sorry, this is so...
I want Lionel to respond to your point, because Lionel has said repeatedly last night and tonight that there isn't an alternative, that this is the only way that can be done, and it has to be done under these rules.
Well, this is the most inventive human civilization we have ever seen, ever. Human civilization is 10,000 years old. Our planet has been around for 3,500,000,000 years. Human beings have been on the planet for about 1 million years. And only 10,000 years ago did civilization emerge. Civilization emerged primarily because our climate became beneficent, became generous, became predictable. What we are now doing to the climate is altering it by the energy production methods that are employed in the wealthy countries of the North primarily. But it is a model which is sold to everyone in the world. Now, here is where I agree with you on the question of a model. Unless you abandon the idea that you can depend interminably upon fossil fuels to create energy for your electricity, for your cars, and so forth, then you're heading down a dead end at a speed which is irreversible. On the other hand, if you find alternative means for creating energy, then you are likely to save your civilization from destruction. My advice to you is to focus upon energy, because that is really the crux of the problem. And the idea of trade, let me tell you, trade is just secondary. It is creating wealth. And the way you create wealth is by having lots of energy that is available to a lot of people at a very low cost. That is the crux of the problem.
I can agree that energy is important, but to agree that we should just not talk about trade then, and that the focus should be on creating wealth. The question is, sorry, just one second. The question is, wealth for whom? Who's negotiating these things? If we look historically, there's not been one instance where we have governments, even elected governments, that are out there negotiating agreements where they don't represent the interests of that country's dominant economic class. Okay, let's get real. Right now, these agreements are being negotiated by the rich for the rich. And the other thing about there being no alternatives, they're out there. Let's talk about the Hemispheric Social Alliance and their document, Alternatives for the Americas. It's lengthy, it's detailed for people who want to check it out. If you actually care about, say, energy policy, about reversing climate change, about spreading democracy and justice, and eliminating poverty, you'd look at what are the alternatives that are coming from the people right now, because the negotiators hiding behind the fences and hiding behind tear gas and riot police, it's clear where their interests lie. And that's you want to talk about oversimplicity or being simplistic? It is a question of democracy. It is a question of who's doing the negotiating, whose interests are being taken into account. Are we talking very short term for a very small group of people, which is the case now, or are we talking about the common good for at least 7 generations down the line?
Right.
just like to, to add to that, that the point about the energy policy would be, the logic of it would still be that this would be commodities bought and sold for profit. And you may be talking about lower costs, but it would still be commodities. And in that sense, beyond any kind of popular control about the direction. But I want to take it back a bit and look at these changes. In the last 10 years, there have been 1,037, from 1991 to 1999, 1,035 changes to foreign investment laws around the world. 94% of those changes increased the rights and powers of transnational corporations and reduced the capacity of governments to regulate them. All right? Is that a weather pattern, or is that a planned political project? I would suggest it's a planned political project that involves an incredible violence done to the alternatives that are available. That it's actually the alternatives are there, but such violence must be done to us by these political leaders to get us down this one path. And I think the police repression in Quebec City is exactly the kind of violence that we face.
Go ahead.
I think it's ironic that people here speak of American imperialism, and I mean...
Actually, the I word didn't come up tonight. It was a
right,
subtext.
okay, in my conversations with people, that free trade is American imperialism. I think that, or corporate imperialism, whatever you want to call it, but I think that in the same way we need to look at applying the sorts of presuppositions that people make here about wealth and about indigenous lifestyles. I was at the thing last night under the bridge where people were clanking on the guardrails, and it felt really tribal, and I guess some people that I spoke to do romanticize a sort of tribal lifestyle. But I think that if we're precluding those individuals in developing countries that are indigenous people from making the choice themselves as to whether or not they want a refrigerator, whether or not they want a car, whether or not they want to engage in economic exchange with a corporation, then that's another kind of imperialism that I think it doesn't make sense.
You don't get charges of reverse imperialism anywhere else, only on CounterSpin. We'll be back in a couple of minutes. We're back on CounterSpin. We are still in Quebec City, and we are finally starting to shift the conversation from a critique and a defense of the free trade area of the Americas and the summit process towards alternatives. We've heard a tremendous amount of criticism in the mainstream media about how the movement, which is throwing rocks in Quebec City, has nothing to offer but a return to protectionism and a sort of a reflexive anti-trade mentality, that there's nothing on the table in terms of alternatives. So I'm going to challenge you to start providing some alternative economic models. We've heard that there's only one way to do this. We need a rules-based framework. It's good for smaller countries. It's good for countries like Canada. I want to hear some alternatives.
I'm Deborah Burke. I'm with the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. I think one of the best ways to look at alternatives is to look at trade agreements and rules that meet the needs of people first and not the needs of corporations. And we've talked a lot today about what the trade agreements are all about. Are they about democracy and human rights and individual rights and freedoms? Well, they're simply not, because they're about the rights of corporations. And the clearest example that anyone in this country, I think, can look at is the UPS challenge under the investor state rules of NAFTA. They're challenging the right of a democratically elected government to establish policy that says we enjoy a public universal postal service in this country. UPS objects to that because it offends their bottom line. They see more profits to be made. So, I mean, there has to be alternatives to that kind of a trade regime.
What is your suggestion? Are you suggesting that Canada pull out of NAFTA unilaterally?
I'd love to see Canada pull out of NAFTA, frankly.
Okay, well, that's not going to happen, so what's your next alternative?
Well, then they should, first of all, they shouldn't be looking at investor state rules in the FTAA agreement. They shouldn't even be negotiating the free trade area of the Americas because it's simply a way of transporting what we've lived with in this country, in the United States and Mexico for about a decade. It's transporting that to 30 some odd other countries. So, what we need to look at is rules that allow governments to develop policies, economic policies, environmental policies that meet the needs of their countries. Lionel's been talking a lot about economic growth and the need to increase wealth. The kinds of trade agreements that our governments are negotiating take away the rights of governments like the government of Antigua to develop those kinds of economic policies and to get into that kind of development and growth.
Now, you were talking about the Hemispheric Social Alliance and the alternatives document. Does anyone have anything to give me from that document or from some of those suggestions? Do you want to outline some of them?
I'd like to touch on a couple of things. One is, as an economic alternative, one of the big issues for us is that you guys have no legitimacy. You two in the middle, okay? Negotiators, I know you're not one of the negotiators, but negotiators that we have right now don't have legitimacy. They don't. If we look at who they are, have they been elected, what interests do they represent, et cetera. We're not just talking about, you know, tweaking the FTAA. So one big thing that I'd suggest is revisiting the concept of GNP and GDP, the idea that more is necessarily better, which, you know, is the logic of the cancer cell, as David Suzuki says. So a concrete alternative that ought to be talked about big time is GPI, Genuine Progress Indicator, where you can get a sense of the true health of the economy, not just by looking at how much activity is going on, because that measures, you know, that judges military production as a good thing. GPI looks at healthcare, it looks at the environment, it looks at labor standards and who's working and who's not. It looks at poverty, etc. That way you get a sense of the society as a whole, and not just, you know, oh, we want lots of profits, but they're going in a couple of pockets. Right?
More alternatives.
An alternative as maybe a comment to frame this discussion about alternatives. You just said on the suggestion of whether Canada should pull out of NAFTA that that's not going to happen. I don't think we should box ourselves in of thinking like that. If we want it to happen, we can make it happen. People on one of the breaks were chanting, there ain't no power like the power of the people, and the power of the people won't stop. If we want to turn this thing around, we as the people can do that. If there's one thing that this convergence of activists on Quebec City this weekend has shown me, is that communities can come together and build an alternative. I don't pretend to have a blueprint. I don't think anyone in this room is going to give you an alternative to the way society is run right now in a 30-second soundbite. But
thank you for calling my bluff. That's quite right.
As the people in this room and as the people of the world, we do have the power to turn this thing around completely and create a society that's good for all of us.
Right. Where's the guy in the black T-shirt that I keep promising I'll come to? Go ahead.
Yeah, one thing, you have explained something very great about the GDP. I don't know if the people know here, but where you have a great car accident and a lot of people are dying, well, that's good for the GDP. And when you have a polluted area, that's good for the GDP also, so you can get unpolluted services. So I guess that reviewing the way that we think, because all those people getting together and negotiating those free trade agreements only think in one way. It's economical way. And if you think that they're going to defend our interest, our health, yes, they're going to talk about education, health, and water, but to privatize it, to see it as a good economical way again. So I guess that we have to turn back our mind. And when we see that the GDP goes up, well, we have to think why. Why?
Well, we reject the GDP idea as well in Antigua GNP. We believe that it is an inaccurate way for measuring economic activity. We believe that there's something that is more important. In fact, the United Nations has developed the United Nations Development Index, which takes into account literacy levels, the health care, how long your people live, what their lifestyles and so forth, and it tries to quantify these things and then measure them. We think it is a better measurement. But we think that there is an even better measurement, something we are developing which we call the Vulnerability Index, which takes into account the number of natural disasters that countries face and whether or not they can respond to them. And in fact, it is done very well. It's been developed by the University of the West Indies in Jamaica and the University of Malta in the Mediterranean. Very good.
So now you have an ambassador to the OAS taking up your cause. We're really making progress here. Unfortunately, there's only one way to do things, which is still negotiate free trade agreements. But we'll get back to that in a minute. We got to take another commercial. Forgive me. We're back on CounterSpin. We are running out of time in Quebec City. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm from Vermont. My name is Doyle. And I think here in Quebec City, people are beginning to rethink, as we've been talking about, the GNP, the GDP. What does it really mean? And what do people really value in their lives? What is democracy? What is freedom? Freedom, I think, according to a lot of people in the streets, is not Coke or Pepsi, Bush or Gore. It's something a little more participatory than that. It's having control over decisions that affect people's lives and returning to a more directly democratic structure of decision-making in our communities that values the environment, that values human dignity, and ultimately human creativity and spontaneity and freedom, and a kind of life that values individuals and communities and the environment over profits for faceless corporations.
Go ahead.
Yes, I just want to pick up on the alternatives that are out there now in terms of internationalism or globalism. And in addition to the Hemispheric Social Alliance paper, which is excellent and should be read, there's the International Forum on Globalization that now has a new economic political agenda. It's going to be taking all around the world and for people to understand. There's been a citizens' inquiry that's come up with 6 basic principles that should inform any kind of globalism. We've got ecological economics, which gives us a model. We've got the Millennium Assembly that met before Kofi Annan's assembly.
Mm-hmm.
They've come out with a wonderful 20-page document and declaration that could form the basis of any kind of global kind of decision-making. And all of these things have one thing in common, and that's that they're principle-based. We also have UNESCO's paper on ethical global governance. The underlying thing here is that it's principle-centered, be it ecological, universal principles, or ecosystemic or systemic. And that's where we have to be looking, not this vested interest economics. It has to be principle-centered. And there's lots of alternatives out there now to explore.
More principles. Elizabeth.
Another thing I want to point out to the ambassador is that there are other economic models even within conventional capitalism. The European Union is designed completely differently from NAFTA, and NAFTA specifically exempts subsidies to oil and gas and the military, and the European Union has a parliament, elections, more democratic processes. So this idea that there's only one way, we can engage in rules-based processes, but we have to learn from our mistakes. NAFTA was a mistake. We need to learn from that before we expand it elsewhere.
Bill.
Well, I just want to say we had an alternative, and we still do have an alternative. But a lot of what we used to do, we had a mixed economy. We regulated corporations more than we do now. We had the auto pact. We had managed trade pacts. We could produce generic drugs in 2 years rather than 20 years. There are all kinds of things that we used to do that we can't do anymore, and there's still some things that we can do, like have a public water system, which we're going to lose if we don't catch on to what's going on. So it's not like before free trade, it was hell on earth, you know? I mean, before free trade, we had all kinds of policies, and we had a country that worked not too badly. So, you know, where's this idea that if we don't have free trade, everything's going to hell in a handbasket?
I want to come back here. I'm just going to duck under this camera. You've been waiting patiently.
I just wanted to make sure, as time's running up for the show, that we don't lose sight of the connection between what we're talking about right now and what's going on in the streets in Quebec outside. And someone had said before that we can't solve our problems by demonstrating in the streets. We actually have to sit down and have a discussion about that. And I'm just like, we can't have that discussion if we're not allowed inside, if we don't have representation inside the fence, if there's a fence and riot cops separating us. And I think that's why we have to be in the street, and how important that was yesterday. And yesterday we witnessed peaceful protesters being gassed, being beaten, being cattle prodded, being arrested, just for trying to get our voices heard and to stand up for what we're talking about right here.
That was actually on Saturday, and TV land gets a little confusing, but your point is there. Go ahead.
Well, I would just add that I think that there's many possible futures, and this is only one of them that we are being presented with by the free trade negotiators, and it doesn't look like a very attractive one. I came here with my son to stand up and be counted. It was supposed to be a democratic process, according to my prime minister. I got assaulted by my government. So there's some real contradictions that are literally right in our face here in Quebec City between what these guys say this process is about and what it smells like when you breathe it in.
I mean, I think one of the things that's already started, I mean, 4.4 million Canadians said they wanted to be in the streets in Quebec City yesterday, and they couldn't be here. And for that, there was 60,000 in the street, despite all of the riot from the police. But more importantly, I think in terms of the alternatives, and to go back to Lionel's point,
we got just a few
if we followed the model that Lionel is proposing, his country will not be there in 10 or 20 years from now, because the sea level is going to rise so high that it'll completely be destroyed. The economic model doesn't work.
On that apocalyptic moment, that's the end of the show. We ran out of time. Thank you all for coming. We're back in Toronto tomorrow. Thank you to the crew here in Quebec City. You've been magnificent working on the CounterSpin trade model. See you next time with more CounterSpin. Now, you had something you wanted to say under the credits. What was your point?
Just simply there are other values in society, values of mutual
Good luck,
those values
hope to see you in Washington. Yes, sir. Good job you had there.
Actually a straight revolutionary. I think we actually have to, because capitalism is the most successful system in human history. I mean, in terms of perpetuating itself and its own power.
Security
security was tight as the Prime Minister arrived inside the perimeter. He was unapologetic.
Welcome to the revolution.
The demonstrators are on the move.
We're hearing that people are getting tear gas and water cannon.
A small minority of people spoil it for the majority.
We're at the second act of this confrontation.
But I'll be goddamned if I'm taking the rap for angry young people.
They're just lobbing tear gas canisters every 10 seconds, and it's really, it's brutal.
No matter how it may have looked, the fact is the weekend unfolded more or less as planned. People with differing agendas, separated by a fence, went about their business. From each group, there were speeches and photo ops, punctuated by barbarity. One side threw rocks and bottles, the other fired tear gas and shot water cannon, and then both claimed the moral high ground. Those facts aren't in serious dispute, but the interpretation of those facts, well, naturally, there is wild disagreement about that.
Spin doctors, they're negotiators. The Americans have their own five-star hotel.
Thursday morning, Maud Barlow is talking to the media, something she will do virtually anytime, anywhere. She is familiar to any Canadian who has paid attention to the debate about free trade and sovereignty over nearly 2 decades. But she has also become an international celebrity in the activist world of the anti-corporate globalization movement.
Well, I'm Maud Barlow, and I'm very pleased to be here. And I just did an interview with Austrian Public Radio. And
Her job for the weekend is to cast the Summit of the Americas as a charade, a cover for big business, camouflage for an anti-democratic corporate agenda.
Hello, Aloma.
Friday morning, Tom DeQuino is talking to the media. Just like Maud Barlow, he's familiar to Canadians.
Yes.
There are, however, no other discernible similarities. As the head of the Business Council on National Issues, he is a voice for the largest and most powerful businesses in Canada.
Listen, I just stepped out of the meeting to do this interview.
His job is to defend the Summit of the Americas as a step forward in creating a more prosperous, secure, free, and democratic community of countries.
Well, let me put it to you this way. If all the protesters could travel with me to various countries in the hemisphere and see the dreaded transnationals at work, what they would see is that the IBMs and the General Electrics and the Nortels and the Microsofts are in fact model employers. Government leaders are arriving. The pomp has begun.
By the time the heads of government from the summit countries arrive, the script for the weekend has more or less been set. The main item on their public agenda will be an open discussion of fundamental democratic rights and freedoms. Many of the participants represent countries whose recent pasts include bloodshed, repression, and military dictatorship. They will agree that the protection of democracy is a condition for their membership in the group.
It's just a hideous affront to democracy.
Democracy is also on the minds of those who come to protest in the streets of Quebec City.
This is it for tomorrow, you guys. This is where it's going to be. The action's going to be all along here, all along the fence down here.
They judge the security fence surrounding the summit site to be an insult to their freedom of expression. It symbolizes their belief they are denied access to power, that they cannot exert pressure on their government. Pressure is part of what drives decision-making, and civil liberties advocate Alan Borovoy says people have a right to it.
To be effective in this world, reason is not enough. Now, to be sure, pressure without reason is irresponsible, but reason without pressure is ineffectual. And the whole idea is that we must be allowed to inflict, various interests must be allowed to inflict pressures on each other and on government. That's what government really listens to. It doesn't listen to reason. Too bad. I wish the world were different, but what it listens to is pressure.
And so, in no time, they pulled sections of the fence apart. For several minutes, the police seem prepared to let the fence go, provided no one crosses into their secure zone. But then the battle begins.
Correct interpretation of that scene is that this is a form of global class warfare, that we have created a system in our country and in our world where absolutely millions of people feel disenfranchised, particularly the young. This is not my creation. I told everybody 15 years ago that we were creating this kind of society and that there would be this kind of reaction. And now we have to ask the question about who's going to take responsibility for this level of anger, or the fact that only 1 in 4 young people are voting now. Where did that come from? You know, I didn't create that, and I think we had better as a society start to ask ourselves this, or you're going to see more gated communities, you're going to see more gated political meetings, which this was the equivalent of a gated city or a gated community, and you're going to see more violence, and eventually people are going to get really, really hurt, and that worries me very much.
Now let's get real about this. I mean, let's get really serious about it. So, you know, I just don't buy that. Is there a legitimate concern among hundreds of thousands of protesters? Yes. What I am seeing now is that globalization is delivering a message to the corporate leadership of the world. And it's saying this: we may have won the economic revolution, or we may think we have won the economic revolution, because now almost all the world, with the exception of Myanmar, North Korea, and Maud Barlow, have accepted the fact that open trade is good. But open trade also can be very uneven. If we want to pursue that successfully, we had better be sure that those who do what we do in other parts of the world accept a much higher level of value and what has now come to be known as corporate social responsibility.
The hemisphere's 34 leaders launched their discussions with a promise to strengthen democracy in the Americas.
Saturday morning, the summit leaders meet in an open session about democracy. This will lead to the declaration at the end of the weekend about their commitment to democratic systems. On top of that, they say they will work towards a charter that will allow active defense of representative democracy in the region.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
There is no public discussion of a free trade agreement of the Americas, but those negotiations will continue behind the scenes for years after this meeting. Outside the security perimeter, thousands are gathering at the site of the nearby People's Summit. They are going to protest, but they have a decision to make about how to protest. The images of the previous day's violence are vivid. Some can still smell tear gas on their clothes. Their choice is between marching back to the fence, where there will be a confrontation with police, or marching safely along an officially sanctioned route away from the summit.
I've often been rather worried about the way we do things in this country at different times, and it has sometimes led me to observe that in Canada, we don't ban demonstrations, we reroute them.
Barlow's group meets privately. They have to sort out what they're going to do about the march. And more important, she has to figure out what she's going to say publicly about the violence.
And what we're saying about what happened yesterday, I cannot say strongly enough how important I think it is excuse me, or all our voices are going. I still got chemicals in my throat, I'm sure of it. All of us, I think, have got to think about what we're going to say. Oh, none of us support the BRICS, obviously, but I'll be goddamned if I'm taking the rap for angry young people.
At the People's Summit, activists from around the world are preaching to the choir. It's all pretty familiar stuff.
Welcome to the revolution.
But Barlow is not of a mood to give that kind of stump speech. She knows how to read her people, knows they are wrestling with the violence question.
Let's talk about vandalism. Let's talk about vandalism. There was some vandalism yesterday. Where was the first vandalism? The first vandalism was in that goddamn hideous wall they put up in our beautiful city. That scar of a wall was the first vandalism. Where's the real violence? Let's talk about that. Well, I say the real violence lies behind that wall. This has been an emotional and difficult time for our movement. There are differences among us, but you know what? The differences are small compared to what we have in common. And today is the day we come together as a family in our opposition to the soul-destroying FTAA and its plan of corporate domination of our hemisphere.
That kind of language about corporate domination of the hemisphere, that's what gets under Tom d'Aquino's skin.
I refuse to debate with Maud Barlow because I consider Maud an extremist. It's because Maud is taking advantage of a situation which is very real, and that is that there are billions of people in the world who are disenfranchised. But what she's telling them is that the fault therein lies with business, transnationals, the free trade agenda. The real issue is not that free trade is bad. Free trade and investment is only a vehicle to achieve more open societies. The thing that is bad is societies where the incentives for education, equality of opportunity, abuse of human rights, disrespect for the environment, and fundamentally, no respect for the rule of law. That's what the real issue is. The real issue is not free trade.
Most of the union members turned that way, away from the walls. Thousands of people are going toward the walls, possibly towards trouble.
By early Saturday afternoon, most of the demonstrators, tens of thousands of them, have joined the officially approved march away from the summit. Their decision is a prudent one.
Don't do that!
The action around the fence has turned ugly again. Police are pelted with rocks and bottles. Flying debris crashes through windows. The police seem to have an endless supply of tear gas. Over and over again, they fire volleys high into the air to disperse the crowd. They are now keeping people well back from the security fence, and the tear gas is drifting for blocks downtown. It's mostly young men this close to the gas. For hours, they make evidently futile assaults on the fence and on the police. It's not easy to get to the bottom of this. For some, it seems merely thrilling. But in others, there is an apparent rage. Writer Naomi Klein keeps close contact with different parts of the movement and offers this explanation for what to many is simply baffling.
What's being expressed here on the streets of Quebec City is rage, and what we're seeing reflected is a subsector of a generation that is totally disenfranchised from the state and has an opportunity here in Quebec City to express that rage in an atmosphere where there are crowds and there's some degree of safety. And to me, what we should be asking is not, is this strategic, is this not, what can we do about it? It's not strategic, it's raw rage, okay? And I think what we should be saying is we want to live in a society where we have a large demographic of young people who feels that the state they owe nothing to the state because they've been discarded.
Upwind of the tear gas is Tom D'Aquino.
And you know what? I don't think we should be fooled. The vast majority of Canadians, the vast majority of people who live in the hemisphere, are not supporters of this extremist agenda, nor are the vast majority of people who are marching here today supporters of the extremist agenda. But, you know, 10,000 years of political history have taught us that they're always extremists, and they're the ones who sometimes we don't take very seriously because we say they're in a minority, but they can make it very difficult for the majority. I think that the way the leaders here have handled this and the restraint is admirable. I'm on my way to this other meeting now. It's up at the Hilton.
Oh, God, balsamic vinegar. Couldn't we have picked raspberry or something?
Having talked the talk, Maud Barlow now faces walking the walk. She never gave herself the